Well, if it isn't Queen AZSHARA, new legendary minion for Voyage to the Sunken City, and it's a really cool one. She's a 5-mana 5/5 Naga, and Battlecry, if you've cast 3 spells while holding this, choose an ancient relic, and the ancient relics are Ring of Tides. That reads, after you cast a spell, this becomes a copy of it that costs 1. So that could be a way to duplicate some kind of crazy build around spell you have in your deck, or just some high value spell, and making it really cheap, which is cool, and it has some flexibility. There's also Xalatath, a 2-mana 0/5 weapon that reads, after you cast a spell, deal 2 damage to the enemy hero and lose 1 durability. So that's basically a 10 damage option there for 2 mana if you got some spells to follow it up. So that could be some crazy game ending burst damage potential. You could also theoretically up that durability. She's a neutral card, so there's some classes that can do that. Also, Horn of the Ancients is a 3-mana spell. It adds a random colossal minion to your hand, and that minion costs 1. So like that makes this a really cool on curve 6-mana play, some crazy colossal. It's random, so you won't always get the one you want or care most about, but I think on average, a 1-mana Colossal is pretty insane. And then finally, the Tidestone of Golganeth is a 1-mana spell. It reads, shuffle 5 random spells into your deck, set their cost to 1, and draw 2 cards. So if you're looking for the Chaos route, Golganeth, I think, there could hook you up. Also, theoretically, a little bit of fatigue protection if desperate. So essentially, Queen AZSHARA here, I think, has a few different ways to play this that, depending on the game state, could be really useful for you. Basically, you've got a setup for a win condition of sorts with Ring of Tides. Some decks might really want to duplicate some super powerful legendary spell or something of that effect, and Ring of Tides allows them to do that. Could also be like burst damage in a pinch too for 1-mana Pyroblasts or something, right? Whatever your heart desires. Then Xalatath is basically a game ender. If you have a lot of spells and spell spam, this can just hit your opponent really hard, which is nice. Horn of the Ancients is a threat developer alongside a 5/5. A Colossal for 6 mana is pretty insane, or maybe just a follow up the turn after. And then Golganeth is like, God, I don't know what, I need some miracle situations. So across these, I think that makes AZSHARA fit really nicely into a variety of game states. If you play her on curve, maybe you go for that big Colossal and try to overwhelm people from there. If you play her late in the game, you got burst damage outs or chaos outs. So I think it's cool. That makes it a high utility card. Now, the 5-mana 5/5 aspect is not going to be super exciting most of the time, but all of these are cheap enough or decisive enough that I think taking the downturn with AZSHARA on 5 is going to be worth the payoff shortly thereafter, especially if you play her when you can start working these cards in more immediately. So I think that makes this a good card. Is it going to be amazing at 5 mana? I don't think it's going to be meta defining necessarily, but I think some decks will definitely be able to afford this. Much like we saw with Kazakis, the 4-mana Kazakis, some decks are okay just tossing in that mid-game threat that can do big stuff and cool stuff. I think AZSHARA very much fills a similar slot as Kazakis in that case, without as much conditionality, I would say. I think this 3-spell aspect, not every deck's going to be able to satisfy that, but many will. It won't be a big problem, and that makes her pretty interesting. Still the same top deck downside for all of these Nagas, but again, I think the payoff here is notable enough to make AZSHARA a pretty neat option indeed. So now let's talk about Priestess Valish, a pretty crazy card. 0-mana legendary for Priest. It's a 1/1 Naga, and the battle cry reads, refresh an empty mana crystal for each spell that you've cast this turn. So essentially here, the option to get lots and lots of extra mana in a given turn if you can set up the right condition. And cards like this are always scary. We've all had so many complaints about mana cheat and people doing too much in a single turn, and it seems like that possibility exists here for Valish. You can even do things like bounce this back to hand. I think cards like Zola are expected to be in the core set based on some teaser images, so, you know, play 5, 6, up to 10 spells even, drop a Valish, get 10 mana, play a bunch more spells, drop a Zola on the Valish, play her again because she's only 0 mana, get a bunch more mana. You could theoretically have a 30+ mana turn with Valish in the right scenarios. That's crazy spooky, of course. Now, the reality, I think, is a little less crazy. It's, I think, going to be more awkward than some people are expecting to get a bunch of spells in a given turn. It doesn't take much necessarily to make this worth it in the early game. Just 1 or 2 spells and getting a little extra tempo on board could be advantageous in the right kinds of decks that are just looking to swarm and go for big pressure. But the kinds of crazy, impossible turns that a lot of people are envisioning for this are going to be tough to set up, particularly because in standard format, Priest is losing things like Nazmani and Sethic, which were fueling the Miracle Priest package of old. It's going to be much, much harder to get those blow-up turns off of this. That said, cards like this always find ways to get broken. They always find ways to do crazy things. So I'm sure some deck is still going to be able to manipulate this into some sort of condition that either sets up a victory or just overwhelms their opponent with stuff to create game-winning kinds of turns and scenarios. So will this be in every Priest deck and, you know, just wreak havoc on the meta? I doubt it. I don't actually think it's going to be that consistent. Will this be a powerful card in some deck down the road? I suspect there's a pretty high chance. Moving on to Whirlpool for Priest, a 9 mana removal spell. It's a nature spell for Priest, which is a little crazy, and it destroys all minions and all copies of them wherever they are. So if your opponent has, say, a Shudderwalk on board if you're in wild formats, and you use Whirlpool, it's going to destroy that Shudderwalk on board. Also, any that they've managed to bounce back into their hand. And you could shut down Shudderwalks. Of course, the reality in wild is probably that they've got a Lothab or Cold Neophytes in there, and you can't really play your Whirlpool, but hey, in theory, you could remove your opponent's Shudderwalks. Now, the reality is that in standard format, you know, your opponent might have a few minions on board, 4 or 5, let's say, and they still have copies left to 3 or 4 of those. So you play Whirlpool, you kill the minions on board, but you also might remove a couple cards from hand and a couple cards from deck for whichever duplicates are floating around still in those other 2 spots. So this can be a real value denier on top of a board clear, because you're shortening the length of their deck and also removing stuff in hand, limiting their resource pool altogether. Pool, get it? So that's, you know, a pretty nice payoff for a 9 mana removal. I should also note some downside here that you can actually destroy your own stuff as well, because wherever they are counts as your hand and deck. And I doubt that's really a reason that holds this card back very often. It's just unlikely to even be playing the same kind of deck or opponent in these sorts of scenarios. And you can always kind of make decisions around that as well. So I think this will retain utility in many cases. All said, this is still a 9 mana spell, and 9 mana removal is awfully slow these days. It was frankly even a little slow back in Plague of Death's days, and they would often run 1 Plague of Death in their list. I could see worlds where Whirlpool in the right kind of minion meta or slow meta is still a one of in some controlled priest lists. I don't expect this being super commonly seen, though, at 9 mana. It's hard for decks to play 9 mana cards. I also don't think this will be that great of a combo denial tool if you're envisioning that. Just because, you know, if your opponent does have some kind of important combo card, they're probably not going to play 1 copy down for the Whirlpool just to Whirlpool away the other one, let alone if they're at 9 mana, they might already have it done and you might be dead by the time this even comes into play. It's sometimes Mutanus is already a little too slow as a combo disruptor. So I don't envision this card as that, but as a solid late game removal card, running 1 of in a control deck, that does make a little bit of sense to me. Moving on here to another 9 mana card. This expansion has so many high cost cards. I'm worried that none of them are going to get played because they're so high cost, but Blizzard is at least taking a leap of faith, and I hope we get to a world where 9 mana cards are viable. This is the Trench Stalker for Warrior. It's a 9 mana 8/9 beast, and the battle cry reads, attack 3 different random enemies. So the ideal use case here is that your opponent has a couple mid-sized minions on board, perhaps. This clears the 2 minions and then also gets to go face for 8 and maybe even leave a body behind. Do note this can't go face 3 times. It does very clearly specify different random enemies, which of course I think was a very important thing, because if this just dealt 24 to face on its own, that would be completely insane. But there's still some utility here, right? It's a little bit of board clear and a little bit of threat and even a finisher sometimes as well, a la that old Ragnaros style where you can either get lucky and hit face or maybe even set up guaranteed face clears, face hits, let's say, as well, or maybe face clears if it does happen to be that lethal. Now, this reminds me a little bit of like a Deathwing Mad Aspect that could be a board clear, but it's not quite as good at clearing the board because Deathwing had more health pool to work with and a higher attack pool as well. So he could clear more things perhaps than Trench Stalker. This is limited both in number, but also might just die to certain scenarios as well. If your opponent has 2 8/8s on board, this might clear those, but might not go face. So the real question for this is like, what deck is actually running this? Probably not good in something like a big deck that's summoning a bunch of stuff. Probably control decks will have much better, faster kinds of removal or threat development. So this one's in a little bit of that weird middle ground where there's nothing wrong with this card. If you randomly generate this, you're probably going to be super happy to play it sometimes. But I don't know the context of which decks are actually making this make sense for them. I think it's just at an awkward mana cost and a little bit too split in what it does. So probably gets left aside when you're building your deck, but still a pretty good card if you randomly just, stumble into this one. So next up here, we have a Sharan Vessel, a new rogue spell, 5 mana. It's going to summon you 2 3/3 pirates with stealth, and it's going to put a Sunken Vessel on the bottom of your deck. The Sunken Vessel is actually a cast when drawn card, which is kind of nice. Most of these Sunken cards you have to spend mana on. This one, once you draw it, it's just activated and you're good to go. And it's going to summon you 2 3/3 pirates with stealth. So in total here, 4 3/3 pirates with stealth. At face value, that's pretty good for 5 mana. The stealth creating some interesting opportunities, maybe a little bit more likely to go face, for instance, in a higher damage output deck. But I'll admit, it's still just a hair underwhelming these days. Like 5 years ago, this would have seemed unimaginably insane. It's like the Hunter Spellstone of old, but like stealth and such. But the way it stands today, the way this is staggered, you kind of got to put some extra work in it to get the pirates right away. It's just perhaps not enough. I don't know if the 3/3s in the front half are really going to keep up. So most decks, are they going to need this, right? There's just other ways to build faster, higher tempo boards. I do think there's this intriguing, probably unlikely, but intriguing combo opportunity where you just pop a bunch of these vessels on the bottom of your deck, and maybe there's even ways to make extra ones. And then you have like Mr. Smite in hand, you drop him, you dredge up all of these 3/3 pirates and create some like face combo. There's already a dredge pirate for 2 mana that you could kind of put together already for a 22 damage combo. Seems not good enough for all the work to me, but maybe there's other ways to spice it up and make it good. So there's opportunities for a card like this to do special things, but I think that's going to be very, very tough. And overall, I think a card like this probably just doesn't quite make the cut. So finally here we have the Slithering Deathscale, a new neutral Naga, 7 mana, 5/9. Battlecry, if you've cast 3 spells while holding this, deal 3 damage to all enemies. So when this goes well, a little bit of board clear and a little bit of face damage. That said, I think there's just a little bit too many things holding this card back. By the time you get to 7 mana, 3 damage isn't a lot on board. There's going to be many scenarios where that just doesn't really address your opponent's stuff at all. And like, yeah, you're getting a 5/9 bonus, but what good is the 5/9 really? It's just kind of sitting there. It's just a lame duck in a lot of ways. 3 face damage probably isn't going to add up to much. And most decks, I think, will have faster, better ways to achieve the same kinds of goals here with the Slithering Deathscale. If they need AoE, they'll just run a more dedicated AoE. If they need damage output, can certainly find more efficient damage. If they need threats, they can find threats. This is one of those jack of all trades cards that does a lot, but it doesn't do any of it especially well. And most decks have a game plan they're pushing towards. Cards that kind of do everything okay often aren't good enough. You need cards that do the one thing you really care about very well, and that means cards like Slithering Deathscale usually fall behind. And I don't even know if this is going to be a good arena card. It's just the normal cop-out for cards like these, because I think casting 3 spells might actually be sometimes fairly hard in arena, as I understand it. So I don't know where Deathscale goes. Probably just one of those, I discovered a Naga, this lines up okay for me, and I'm happy to have it, but certainly not a card that I'm putting in my deck. Queen AZSHARA is a 4-star card. Priestess Valish is a 4-star card. Whirlpool is a 3-star card. Trench Stalker is a 3-star card. A Sharan Vessel is a 2-star card. Slithering Deathscale is a 1-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this review number 7, I think. That's it. Curious to hear your thoughts on these cards. Is Valish totally busted? Tell me in the comments below. Thanks so much, as always, for watching. And until next time, game on.